Okay, we'll go live then. Could I have your full name, title, and you can then swear either an oath or an affirmation, please.
Thank you. My name is John Charles Macintosh.
It works better.
I am a Director and Principal Water Engineer with Engineering Consultants, Water Solutions Proprietary Limited. And my oath, I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me should be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you. Mr. Molino, would you like to do the same, please?
Yes. I'm Stephen Donald Molino. I'm the Managing Director of Molino Stewart, an environmental and natural hazards management consultancy. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Mr. Macintosh, would you like to start with a short 2-minute opening statement?
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. So good afternoon, committee members. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk with you, and I thank you for your invitation to do so. I'm a chartered professional engineer, and I specialise in the area of water engineering. I have considerable experience in issues associated with river flooding. These include, for example, quantification, hazard and risk assessment, mitigation, protection and management. I also have considerable experience in connection with community issues involving the hazards of flooding and its consequences, including one notable tragedy involving multiple loss of life. My submission that I've made to the government has been one that emphasises, or one that implores them to follow an integrated, evidence-based process when dealing with development proposals affected by natural hazards. In the case of the Powerhouse Museum, this process should serve to ensure that the proposed development would minimise to an acceptable level the associated risk to life and property if it were to be constructed within the Parramatta River flood hazard area. So that's my motivation for being here today, and as I said, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Molino?
Yes, Mr. Chairman and honourable members, thank you for inviting me to provide evidence to this committee in relation to the flooding issues at the site. From the age of 3, visits to the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences were part of my childhood and adolescence and probably influenced me to study engineering and science at university. I took my children to the museum but after it moved to Ultimo, but after we moved to Western Sydney, those visits petered out. So, at a personal level, I would be delighted by a move by the Powerhouse Museum to Parramatta, where it would be much more accessible for me and my grandchildren. However, at a professional level, I have serious concerns about the site that's been chosen and the lack of proper consideration of flood risks in the museum's design. I understand that the committee has a copy of my initial analysis of the site's flood risks and how the design brief and preliminary design concept responded to those risks, but since then I've reviewed the EIS and prepared a subsequent report which considers the design details which are in the EIS. Suffice to say that the EIS does not allay any of my concerns in my original report, but heightens most of them and introduces some new ones. Fundamentally, there's been an almost complete failure in the design to consider the impacts of floods which exceed the level of a flood with a 1 in 100 chance per year. Now, while such floods are rare, they can and do occur. In 2011 and 2010, there were numerous floods in Victoria and Queensland with probabilities as low as 1 in 200 chance per year and even less. And the Lockyer Valley flood, which you probably remember destroyed Grantham, has some estimates saying it was a 1 in 2,000 chance per year event. The New South Wales Floodplain Development Manual requires consideration of the potential impacts of the full range of floods, right up to the probable maximum flood, and a risk-based assessment used to determine appropriate design responses to those risks. So, for example, it's generally accepted that a shop or an office need only be protected against floods up to the 1 in 100 chance per year event. and to offer a higher level of protection to common office furniture and fittings is not economically worthwhile. However, where lives are at risk, modern practice is to provide protection up to floods close to the probable maximum flood, which might only have a 1 in a million chance of occurring. In the case of the museum design, there is virtually no consideration of what happens in these larger events. This means that the design as it currently stands, people in the Riverside precinct and proposed undercrofts have no reliable means of safely escaping rising floodwaters and may be forced to enter hazardous floodwaters to reach high ground. People inside the museum with mobility challenges will have no means of escaping from rapidly rising floodwaters, which could rise up to 4 metres inside the building. The collections on the ground floor have no protection from the direct impacts of flooding, which exceed the ground floor level. And the unique collections on other floors, which rely upon maintenance of AA class climate control for their preservation, will be exposed to unacceptable humidity levels for days, if not weeks. In short, the design as it currently stands considers people and the museum's unique collections to be worth no more than common office furniture. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
Mr. Molino, so with the current site that the government has picked, is there any way to mitigate the concerns or the flood problems that you've highlighted in your 2 reports?
For some of them, yes. So, for example, people with inside the buildings, the risk to people's lives inside the buildings, by providing disability access ramps with inside the building, may be a way of providing suitable escape routes up to levels above the probable maximum flood. But some analysis would need to be done in that regard, because these floods can rise very rapidly, and you would have to do some calculations in terms of how quickly those rose, how quickly people could get up those ramps, and how many people would be relying on the ramps and the stairs, because the lifts would be out of action because they're proposing to build the substation at ground floor level. So it would go out as soon as the ground floor floods.
So we've heard evidence that it will create channels, and it would drive people.
Yeah, well, that's the other problem that you have. There's 2 types of flooding that affect the site.
Can you take us through it?
Yeah, sure. So there's the river that comes up,
Yep.
and there's the water running down through the streets of Parramatta, trying to get down to the river.
Yep.
Okay?
Yep.
And any building that you put in the way of that water will have to find its way around those buildings.
Is it similar to when you find in major international cities these wind tunnels, where all the wind gets collected and then it just
It's exactly that. Well, you only have to go out here to experience the wind tunnel effect. That's right. So yes, you have a flow, and the way things work at the moment in Phillip Street is that Phillip Street fills up and overflows through Willow Grove grounds and through, I think it's called, I've got to get this right, Dirra Barry Lane.
I can't remember.
Yeah. And also near the Wild Street Bridge. So there's 3 overland flow paths where that water flows down to the river. And what is proposed, as I understand it from the design details that I've seen, is to reinforce those channels and in fact to try and direct more of the water down those channels so that it doesn't build up to a higher level in Phillip Street. But that might be okay as it goes, except that they're also the proposed escape routes from these undercroft areas. So you actually would have to be walking up against a cascade coming down these pathways.
But this would also happen even when there is just heavy normal rain.
Yes.
So we're not just talking about 1 in 100s, but we're talking about.
Yes, that's quite correct. The undercroft areas are actually affected in the more frequent events.
Yeah.
So these undercroft areas are underneath the building, below the 1 in 100 flood level, and they have 2 problems. The one is, to get out of there, you have to walk down towards the river, which is rising.
Yep.
And then if you've managed to negotiate that hazard, then you have to walk up the paths that are cascading with the flows coming down towards the river. So there's been no provision for safe escape routes from those undercroft areas.
So even with sort of a moderate, I'm not talking about a 1 in 100, but, when you have quite a heavy rain,
Look,
a couple
the
nights,
rain we had in February...
I was going to say a couple...
the rain we had in February would have cut off access out of those undercroft areas. Now, it did not flood well.
We did see
I'd have
footage.
to have a look. I'd have to look at the levels. It may or may not have gone into those undercroft areas as they're proposed.
Are you able to, in a sense, nominate what the February rainfalls would have constituted?
It was the flood level that was reached there was less than a 1 in 10 chance per year event, maybe even only a 1 in 5 chance per year event. It's a common event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, just draw a little bit out.
Yeah, that's where I was going.
The kind of the specifics of that having to walk up as the rain comes down, and specifically for people with mobility issues, specifically for people with prams. I mean, these are more like It's not just people who are sitting around here who would necessarily be trudging up.
It's not necessarily going to be fit and able adults. You'll have children, you'll have people with mobility challenges, and it's not just the depth of the flooding, it's the velocity of the flood waters. It is very difficult to keep your feet in high velocity flood waters, and the challenge is that once you get away from Phillip Street, it drops rapidly down to the river, and that accelerates the water. And so, it would be a real challenge for an able-bodied person to walk up against those flows, let alone someone that is infirmed or young, like a small child, or people with mobility challenges.
We heard some evidence earlier, and it'd be interesting to hear your expert view on it, that the sort of surrounding buildings to the site, which are very large high-rise buildings, have the consequence of sort of taking rain and water in a storm situation and sort of accelerating that towards the ground. There was some evidence that sort of surrounding setting would potentially exacerbate.
No, look, I think the fact that Parramatta CBD is all concrete and bitumen means that any rain that falls essentially runs off.
Yeah.
So every drop, and whether it's falling on the roof of a building or whether it's falling on a pavement at ground level, it doesn't increase the amount of water that runs off.
Mr. Will, you were referring to actually the February 9th, 2020
That's correct.
rain event.
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, there's a building at 32 Phillip Street, which is right next to Willow Grove, and between Willow Grove and that lane. Floodwaters entered that building, but they weren't floodwaters from the river, they were floodwaters from Phillip Street. So Phillip Street filled up sufficiently to flood the foyer of that building at 32 Phillip Street.
Now, Dr. Macintosh, on the audio link, in your submission you refer to doing the museum on a floodplain as, quote, risky business. Do you still stand by that evidence?
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. I think, and standing back from the details of this, of what's proposed for this development, the key aspect to risky business is ignorance as to what the circumstances are and what the ramifications could be. Now, the way to deal with this in any development proposal is to actually work the problem seriously. And work it in a way with an appreciation as to what human nature is like and how people interact with floods. Now, Steve Molino mentioned the Grantham Floods, and I had the privilege to be the Grantham Floods Commission on Inquiry's flood engineer to assess the circumstances surrounding that. Now, as part of that process, I was exposed to and had to thoroughly investigate every single fatality that occurred and the circumstances associated with those fatalities. And what came crystal clear out to me is that when floods occur, people do strange things and they get themselves into problems and they are just so vulnerable. I had people in wheelchairs on Triple O drowning while on the call. I had people trapped on riverbanks who were watching the floods being washed away. I had people in cars who thought they could make it through and got to a spot where they were stuck and then drowned. I had state emergency services people who went with their trucks to save their families and ended up losing their children out the door with the floodwaters washing through. So flooding is a very hazardous thing. It doesn't take much to drown people. It's not cities, it's countries, and it's something that people just are not aware of the hazard. So when it comes to development proposals and so forth, in my view, it's an issue which needs to be looked at just very soberly and thoroughly with the view of protecting human life.
Now,
Floodplains are dangerous places, and as we've seen that all the time with people crossing roads and so forth, people lose their lives.
Now, Dr. Macintosh, have you been to the Parramatta? Have you been to, or have you surveyed the data relating to the Parramatta site?
Yes. Now, with the Parramatta site, I'm a Brisbane lad,
Yep.
so it's not my home turf. So the information that I'm aware of with the Parramatta site is purely that information which is published in the reports prepared by others, and of course tempered with that with historical news events which have been published as well. I've discussed the issues there with some of my colleagues who are members of the Institution of Engineers, National Committee on Water Engineering, and understand there are issues there to be taken seriously. So I haven't got the intimate knowledge that Mr. Molino has got, but I've certainly got the appreciation of flood hazards in flood areas.
Okay. Well, on that point, Mr. Molino, so in the evidence to us and in previous inquiries, the ARUP report relied on 1987 flood data. Has Parramatta changed, the landscape there changed significantly from 1987?
Well, there's actually been a change in the methodology for calculating runoff from rainfall. So Engineers Australia publish what's the Bible of Australian rainfall and runoff.
Yep.
It was published in 1987, but there's a more recent publication, and so there is a new methodology in 2019. I understand that methodology is being applied by Parramatta Council in a flood model that they have commissioned and is imminent for release, and the data in that would be much more reliable than the methodology that is being used by ARUP. But ARUP chose to use the 1987 methodology, and understandably, I can understand why they've done this, so that they could compare it with the flood levels that are currently adopted by Council, which are also based on the 1987 methodology. But it's a change in methodology rather than a change in the amount of development. And though
Okay, that is where I was trying to take you. So okay.
Yeah. But so there is a newer methodology, and they did ARUP. Again, to be fair to their analysis, they did compare. They were given permission to compare their results with those interim results from the 2019 methodology that Parramatta Council is using, but that only compared the flooding in the river, but it's the flooding that's coming down the streets which is which is setting the level that they're choosing for the current floor level. And there's no comparison there. So I just don't know how good their modelling is in that regard.
Just to give it, so one last thing, I'll make this my last.
No, take it.
So to give a sort of a perspective or a comparison, so what would it be like to be walking up water coming down like this? Like, would it be like standing in front of a fire hose, like, what would the velocity or the force be like? Would it just be like a trickling stream?
No, it would be like trying to walk up a creek that is
Up a
flowing.
creek?
Yes, trying to walk up a creek which is got a fair amount of flow in it. It's going to be shin to knee deep or even higher.
Oh.
And the sorts of velocities could knock you off your feet. I'm actually a whitewater kayaker and trained in swiftwater rescue.
Yeah.
You know, there are ways and means of negotiating that type of thing, but not as John says, the average person would not know how to do it, and even people that are trained in it would be wary at some of the flows that would be going down there.
So would it be comparable to like trying to navigate up a rip when you're swimming in an ocean?
Well, no. It's like standing at the beach,
Yep.
right? And you're in maybe knee-deep water,
Yep.
and there is a strong rip, and you know how that can knock you off your feet. Now, you can be standing in a spot in that rip, and you can feel the sand moving from under your feet. You're reasonably stable while you've got both feet on the ground. As soon as you lift 1 foot off the ground, then you become unstable. Now, if you're going to have to walk up these steps, you're immediately going from a stable 2 feet on the ground stance to 1 foot on the ground. You've halved your stability, or less than halved your stability.
Thank you.
Can I just, and look, this is not in any way, and please take it, it's not in any way criticism of either you, Mr. Molino, or you, Dr. Macintosh, but are you giving, in a sense, evidence jointly, or are you entirely independent in your views in terms of what you're saying?
No, completely independent.
And again, that's not meant as a criticism. I'm just trying to work out your tag teamers.
Just for the understanding of the committee, Dr. Macintosh and I did work together on a project in Queensland about 6 or 7 years ago. I've not done any other work with John since then, and I only had the opportunity to read his submission to the inquiry after I'd already prepared my report. So. Yeah,
Again, I just want to emphasise, I'm not suggesting anything. I just wanted to
there's been
understand the
no
dynamic.
collaboration whatsoever.
Yeah, right.
I just had one question that perhaps Mr. Molino or Mr. Macintosh might want to answer. We've talked a little bit about the potential impact and safety consequences of a flooding event for people
Yes.
on the site, visitors or people in and around the precinct. But I wanted to talk about the impact on the built form. And as we know, even if there is a flooding event or a storm event, and thankfully there are no physical injuries, the consequence for the building, the mud, the debris, the damage, and just draw a little bit out about how significant that could be.
Yeah, sure. Look, we're talking about a large concrete multi-storey building. That building should be able to be designed against the impacts of flooding. So the stability of the building is not an issue. Mud and debris getting inside the building, yes, that is an issue, and it would be a significant effort to clean that out. That doesn't concern me so much. If it were an office building, in fact, you know, I would have no issues with office buildings being built near there, not necessarily right down as close to the river as this building's being proposed, but in some of those areas with a smaller footprint, and having a floor level at the same level as this museum, and the water going in and you having to clean out afterwards. The probability of having to do that, in my view, is an acceptable probability, and it fits with council's development standards for office buildings.
You chuck out the office furniture.
Exactly right. Exactly right. But yeah, but loss of life is a different standard, and unique collections have to have a different standard as well. You know, it's like, you know, security on your building. If you have no contents that are worth much, you don't bother about burglar alarms and back to base and deadlocks and all of that sort of thing. But if you've got things that are highly valuable, you not only have those things, but you might have them locked in a safe, hidden, and all of that sort of thing. So it's about risk management appropriate to the value of what it is that you're exposing to that risk.
Absolutely, thank you. And Mr. Macintosh, Dr. Macintosh, I wondered if you just had any reflections on that as well.
Yeah, I absolutely concur with Ms. Molino on that one. The thing to emphasise there is that when it comes to flooding and flood immunity, it depends very much on the value of that asset to the community. So your hospitals and your power supplies and your communications will be up high, and as the services become of lower value to the health and well-being of the community, you can accept a higher chance of inundation and loss of that asset. So basically, it's sort of like, or flood immunity is like an insurance policy. You have an insurance policy against something that you can't afford to lose, and if that something will affect the health of your community, you have a very good insurance policy. If it's someone's life, exceptionally good insurance policy, and that's the way it needs to work, and it does work. The other thing I'd like to just emphasise here, and to assist you in these probabilities and so forth, we're talking of national levels of, say, the 1 in 100-year flood level and so forth, or the 1 in 20. Now, for establishing levels of inundation, these are benchmarks that people might choose for consistency. But I think the important thing to realise when we're talking about probabilities, particularly when it comes to risk management, and I emphasise this, is that when we say something is a 1 in 100, or more correctly, a 1% annual exceedance probability, it means that that event can be expected to have a chance of occurring in every single year of 1 in 100. So every year there's a 1 in 100 or 1% chance of it occurring in any year. In 2 years, well, there's a chance of 2% that it will occur in 2 years. In 50-year period, there's a 1 in 2 chance of such a thing occurring. So when it comes to issues such as designing against loss of life and so forth, and the life of the item might be a 100-year life or a 200-year life, you're needing to consider a very, very high probability because it's an accumulative thing that's going on. So that's the other aspect that I think goes hand in hand with decisions associated with choosing an appropriate standard on a design standard when it comes to losses.
Mr. Molino, I want to ask a question. Given the current design proposal for the Parramatta site, what, if anything, could be done to mitigate those flood hazards you were talking about earlier?
Well, certainly in terms of protecting people inside the building, better disability access from the ground floor to upper floors so that people could escape without having to rely upon the lifts. But that would require careful design. I think really in terms of protecting the collections, you'd actually have to find some way of excluding water from the building. That is achievable, but becomes a very expensive exercise. And you would have to have an emergency power supply to the building. So you would have to have a diesel generator at a level that's above the probable maximum flood level within the building so that you could switch over to emergency power. In terms of the people external to the building, look, you're either going to have to get rid of those undercroft areas or you're going to have to provide an additional access from those at a continually rising gradient up to the ground level within the building so that people are able to walk away from the rising floodwaters and not walk up the cascades that are coming down around the building. I think they're the only ways that you're going to be able to achieve that. But having, subsequent to my first report, having looked at the design, some of the design details in the EIS, is that there is a reliance on the design to deal with the ponding that currently occurs in Phillip Street, and part of that goes down through the Willow Grove property. Now, the design proposal is to basically block that flow path off directly and to put a pipe through that then takes it through to the other side. But there's not sufficient information in the EIS for me to be able to know whether that has been properly designed for the potential for that that pipe to block, and if it does block, then that water level just builds up and then overflows. And if they can't rely upon that underground pipe to replace the overland flow that currently goes through Willow Grove, then they will have to build a higher floor level because their 1 in 100 level gets higher, but then that provides a bigger dam, and they're just chasing their tails. So at the moment, the design is essentially to build a ground, not just inside the building, but outside, a ground floor level plane at a level, I think it's 7.5 metres, which essentially dams Phillip Street. And the flow runs down the lane, runs down near Wild Street Bridge, or it goes through this pipe and then pops out and goes down to the river. Now, if that pipe doesn't achieve its objective, then that dam is just going to make the water level rise even higher and more water go round the sides. So I think that's something that hasn't been properly looked at.
That doesn't address the threat to human life of anyone that's on the...
No, but I think it's a real design challenge in actually being able to design the building the way that they're doing it, with these two buildings that have a floor level at exactly the same level as the outside level. I think they're going to have to somehow lower that outside area to provide, if you like, a relief valve to the ponding that occurs in Phillip Street. I think it's a completely wrong design approach.
Just looking at your diagrams in your report, it does seem that in certain flood events, of course, that the water does come right around the whole site.
Well, that's right. So what happens?
So how do you evacuate it from within the building if that happens?
Well, you don't. So what we would advocate in those circumstances is what we call shelter in place. So that you stay upstairs within the building, but that building needs to be designed to accommodate that and to encourage people to do that. So emergency power supply is certainly one of the things. Don't forget that flooding in Parramatta only lasts for a few hours. Okay, so to shelter within a building just for a few hours is not a big deal, in my opinion, providing that building has made adequate provision for people to safely shelter within that building. But within that few hours, within only a few minutes, people will die if they don't have adequate shelter or an adequate escape route to those shelters.
Might I also contribute, please?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thanks. The other item to bear in mind is that the whole idea of having the museum at this location is to attract people to the area. So to succeed, the objective is to get lots of people to come to Parramatta, and this won't just be around the museum; it'll be in the whole area. So we're looking at increased people in the area and exposing more people to the hazards surrounding the area. So just looking at the museum and the proposed museum and egress paths from that museum is not the full story in that regard, I don't think. The other thing I'd like to just emphasise is that when it comes to flooding and so forth, we engineers were always trying to improve our understanding as to Mother Nature and how it rains and why it rains and where it rains and how much it rains and so forth, as discussed with the new version of AR&R, the engineering Bible, so to speak. But one thing is for certain, and the 2011 event and so forth demonstrated this. That event was really circumstances which occurred which didn't really hit anyone's radar that these meteorological conditions could develop. And that's Mother Nature for you. So we are really trying to get Mother Nature to follow our rules, but she doesn't follow our rules all the time. So the precautionary principle really does apply in these issues, and we've got to look at it very carefully in that manner. And I don't often like using this as a throwaway line, but it is a real one, in that there is additional uncertainty with our climate change in these aspects as to how this will affect things. And, you know, it's something which is very hard to quantify, but it does underscore the requirement to look broader and have resilience in whatever plan is put in place. And once again, it comes back to having a really good evidence-based approach to examine this issue in an integrated manner with the environment. And that is, as Steve has said, he hasn't seen that in his review of the EIS, and it's a serious omission, I feel.
Thank you. Any more questions?
I have one last question.
One last question. Okay.
I'm sorry, because okay, and in
know he never tells the truth.
fact, it may be just a yes or no.
Yeah, no.
Okay,
that's fine.
Mr. Molino, do you have any knowledge, or were you asked to provide any information on the Fleet Street Cumberland Hospital / female factory site?
No.
Thank you.
I just had one brief thing, Chair. I just wondered, Mr. Molino, if you wanted to comment on that last statement from Dr. Macintosh about the potential impact of climate change on the nature of these unexpected weather events. I mean, it was something that had occurred to me, that these extreme or unexpected weather events do appear, certainly to a lay non-scientist like myself, to be occurring with more frequency.
Yep. Yeah.
You're not old enough.
I'll accept that interjection.
Oh, no.
Proudly. Sorry, Mr. Molino. We're right at the end of the day.
Anything that's
That's
recorded
fine.
here.
Look, certainly
It's not a debate.
the modelling, the climate change modelling that has been done both internationally and nationally would suggest that the intensity of rainfall events are going to increase, and so therefore the type of events that I'm saying haven't been considered are likely to be more common and more frequent in the future. We don't know that for certain, but as Dr. Macintosh said, the precautionary principle needs to be applied here. We're talking about people's lives, and as he rightly pointed out, we're talking about thousands of people being attracted to this particular site. So we're talking about large numbers of people. It's not the odd person here or there trying to drive across a causeway. It's large numbers of people congregating in this area.
The government is saying, and the business plan is saying, up to 2 million visitors a year.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a very busy place.
And may I just add one other thing to just help you, I guess, get some of these probability issues in your head. It is frequent events, or more frequent events, that are a threat to people in that Undercroft area. It is events less frequent than the 1 in 100 event. As Dr. Macintosh pointed out, though, that the longer period that the building is there, the more likely it is that that's going to happen. And you can't just expect maybe one of these events in 100 years. In Kempsey in 1949, they had a 1 in 100 event. The following year, 1950, they had an event that was almost the same size. And on the Georges River in southwestern Sydney in the late 1800s, they had 3, maybe even 4 events that exceeded a 1 in 100 event. So these events can happen in quick succession. So if we go into a La Nina period, as we are at the moment, then we could see a series of floods one year after another, and then we could go for 100 years and not have one. So it's a bit of a lottery. When you're playing with things that are difficult to replace, it's not the sort of lottery that you want to be playing.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
All right. Well, thank you very much. No more questions?
Nope.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Molino. Thank you very much, Dr. Macintosh.
Macintosh. Thank you,
It's
Dr.
an absolute
Macintosh.
For coming
Thank you.
today.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll call it a day, and it's just about 5 o'clock, I think.